So one question I'm always asked: who would win in a fight? Who would win in a fight if Galactus fought the Hulk? Or if Thor fought Iron Man? And there's one answer to all of that. It's so simple. Anyone should know this. The person who'd win in a fight is the person that the scriptwriter wants to win. These are fictitious characters. The writer can do whatever he wants with them.
Hello, and welcome to Writing 101. Today, you are going to witness the death of a channel before it's even started, because I am going to make a video where I disagree with Stan Lee. The little clip you watched was a decent point made by Stan Lee about the technicalities surrounding fight scenes in the stories he or any other writer contrives. What he says here is absolutely true. The winner of the fight is technically up to the writer. However, this technicality does not translate into the reality of story writing in many cases, especially with stories where power systems are strictly defined. Still, Stan Lee is an extremely successful writer, and he does make a very logical deduction about the heart of storytelling. We simply disagree on the conclusion. Everyone knows that stories are fake, fictitious, written by people who have designed the entire universe within their own minds. I ask you, though, to think about a moment where you have been watching an intense scene in a show. I want you to seriously consider exactly what you were thinking at the moment. Were you presently cognizant of the fact that everything in the story is fake, and that the results don't matter beyond what the writer wants to happen? For me, at least, the answer is no. And that's because there is actually so much more going into a story than simply what the writer wants to happen. Think of Han Solo for a moment. A rugged, charming, self-confident individual. He has just been captured by Boba Fett and Darth Vader. He's about to be frozen in carbonite, and as he is dropped into the ground, Princess Leia, distressed and desperate, tells Han Solo that she loves him. Then, before he is dropped into the pit to be frozen, Han hears the confession and giggles like a blushing schoolgirl as he descends on the platform. I wonder what your reaction was to what I just said. I imagine that even with my simple description of the scene, your mind was drawing you into it, and you were remembering the intensity and tension of the scene. And when I got to where Han Solo says the famous line of "I know," you were kicked out of it by the sheer dubiousness of the reaction I gave him. I ask you, when I made this scene, did I make a mistake? I was describing these characters, and they were, in that moment, mine to manipulate as I pleased. I was, for a second, the writer of these two characters and the contriver of the scene they just had. I have every right to imagine the scene how I wanted, and I gave you the story as I saw it. According to Stan Lee, this would be what matters because I am the writer, and the story is controlled by what I want to happen. The answer, of course, is that I made a massive mistake. The question is why? If it is really a fictitious character that only matters so long as it matches my narrative decisions, why was my scene a mistake? The answer was because I, as a writer, am not completely in control of these characters. Not anymore, at least. See, as Stan Lee said, the writer is the determining factor of a story, but the story itself is there to be witnessed by an audience. The audience is filled with thinking, analyzing, intelligent humans, and their brains are picking apart everything they collect about the story they watch. Expectations are formed, characters are filled within their minds, an entire foreign universe is constructing itself around them with strange new rules and intriguing concepts, and their brain, at that exact moment, is posed with a question. Do I accept the information I'm receiving? If it does, the most magical thing happens. The audience's brain, having accepted the story, allows them to dive into the universe as though they were in it themselves. Despite the fact that it's fake, and that they know it's fake, their brain accepting the information in the story has given them the most amazing illusion of the world actually existing around them. As the writer, that is your goal, to sell the illusion. The audience, of course, wants to be immersed, so there is a certain amount of anti-realism they are capable of willfully ignoring. But their suspension of disbelief can only be pushed so far before it breaks. You, as the writer, are balancing on a tightrope, where you are attempting to create a universe worth immersing oneself in, while simultaneously keeping the audience in a position where they can still convince themselves to believe the illusion. In order to do this, especially in worlds where fantasy is a major element, the writer has to appeal as much to the human brain as possible in the areas where they can, in order to have enough suspension left in the areas where it can't. One way that this is done would be by creating characters that are convincing and appeal to logic. By creating convincing characters, the writer allows the audience to latch on to something familiar and understandable in a universe that is otherwise completely foreign and separated from reality. This is why in a story like Sword Art Online, a story that is based around people entering full dive VR machines that allow them to exist as a human entity in another world, the first thing my mind truly disconnects on is when Kirito breaks the characterizations I attributed to him. My suspension allowed me to accept that, theoretically speaking, there is a world where full dive MMOs exist. My suspension even allowed me to believe that someone could get away with trapping everyone in the game. One of the things helping my brain keep the illusion was the characters that I understood, and once they broke, my ability to believe the illusion broke as well. One of the most important aspects of keeping the audience within the illusion is having ironclad internal consistency. Yes, the universe the audience witnesses might only be believable in the most theoretical and abstract sense, but our suspension can handle that. What it can't handle is when the universe doesn't even work within itself. Our minds are capable of thinking on a purely theoretical level. We understand how to apply rules to scenarios, even if the rules in the scenarios are completely contrived. This is why power systems are so fun in fantasy genres. Avatar: The Last Airbender is massively popular for how well it defined and implemented a very creative power system, and people were allowed to invest themselves into this illusion of a magical world with magical powers partly because the rules were so well defined and kept consistent. If this theoretical construct of magical rules and powers were broken, however, things would start to collapse. If a waterbender could somehow bend fire without an explanation that could keep our suspension intact, then we would suddenly find ourselves incapable of believing the illusion because our brains can no longer consider it as a valid construct because, internally speaking, it is flawed. Going back to Stan Lee's take on the subject, I now asked myself the question of if a writer is fully in control of their own story. My answer to that question has to be no. There are things that a writer cannot do once they have defined something as a theoretical construct within their story without breaking their audience's suspension, and one of those things is the power systems they create. If a person has a certain, defined set of characteristics, strengths, and weaknesses, the audience's suspension of disbelief hinges upon the consistency of those traits. If a character is then shown breaking those traits without a really good explanation, that hinge will snap, and the illusion will collapse. This is a major reason why it does matter who would theoretically win in a fight between the characters an author creates. Just look at Joel from The Last of Us 2. He was a brilliant character who was loved by many. His characterization was a major hinge for us to stay attached to the story. When he died the way he did, in the situation he did, portraying the traits he showed, there was a massive backlash from a large portion of the fan base. The particulars of his death meant so very little to the actual core of the story, but they turned out to be the first thing that made a lot of people break from the illusion, and this is because that seemingly insignificant detail is massively important when it comes to convincing the human brain to buy what it receives. This is an example from a story that is very much grounded in reality, and this makes it even more important to keep these consistencies on track, but it extends to pretty much every story out there. Of course, not every story comes with the same level of suspension for everyone. Stories made for comedic purposes, stories made for children, or even stories made to promote a mindless power fantasy are obviously going to be treated less seriously by the audience, and because of this, the writers can stretch the audience's suspension further before it breaks. Superhero stories, like the ones Stan Lee wrote, generally have the ability to stretch suspension a bit further, so making sure every single fight is properly conforming to logic and keeping the relative power levels of every character consistent isn't as important. But even stories like these can only be stretched so far. Consider Batman vs. Superman. The power levels of these characters are so astronomically different that Batman winning the fight is generally impossible. Yes, like Stan Lee said, the fight is, at its core, a contrivance of the author, but writing the fight scene in the very few ways that Batman can actually win is enough to knock many fans out of the illusion because they are humans who are aware of the very fact that Stan Lee just told us. Seeing Batman pull a win out of his ass sets off an alarm in our brains that what we are seeing isn't logical, and this, in turn, ruins immersion because it is impossible to dive back into the illusion of the story if we are forced to recognize that it's a farce. So, yes, Stan Lee is correct. A writer has the ability to write anything they want in a story that is of their own creation, and they also have the ability to completely ruin the audience's opportunity to truly experience the universe they've made by writing something logically irresponsible or contradictory to the universe's own rules. This is why it is even more important that writers recognize the power they have over their own stories and conform to logic at every turn possible, as if their universe were actually real. Because treating it like nothing more than the fictitious ramblings of the author is a very good way to make sure that they miss the end goal and fail to sell the illusion. With that said, I'll see you guys in the next one.